In Los Angeles culture, there's a neighborhood called Beverly Park. And love it, hate it, or you may not even know about it. It is a colossal economic and cultural statement to our community. And we all need to know about it, whether we're representing buyers or sellers. Every person in this room needs to know about Beverly Park. In my mind, it's a phenomenon. It's relatively new. I think you'll find it fascinating. And we have just the person, and I'm delighted he agreed to speak to us this morning, and that's Richard Manion. He'll be up in just a moment. Aero Architectural, besides helping people, we're very high class. Richard received his architectural degree from Columbia University a few years ago. And right after that, of course, he started his career at the absolute top with an architect you may know named Robert Stern. Yeah. After that, he would then go off to another venerable firm in New York, and he is a member of every prominent, prestigious architectural group you can imagine, and is just a terrific all-around person. I've had the great fortune of getting to know him through the Institute of Classical Architecture, where he was a board member. Richard established his own Los Angeles firm in January 2010, but that was after a 15-year partnership with another architect you probably know about, Mr. Hablinski, and that firm was called Hablinski Mannion Architecture. Richard's current firm, the one that started last year, has 16 in staff. They oversee projects in California, Hawaii, Idaho, New York, Nevada, Texas, as well as overseas commissions in China, France, Indonesia, Mexico, and Singapore. The firm has been lauded with about every architectural award you can imagine, including the top 30 residential architects in the Robb Report, which we all know about. His residences have been published in, of course, Architectural Digest, California Homes, Veranda, the Robb Report Luxury Home, Angelino, and The Classicist. Books that he's in include Dream Houses of Los Angeles, The Legendary Estates of Beverly Hills, which is terrific, and Perspectives on Design. And this actually was probably November this book came out, right?
Yes, October.
Right here, and this is what we're raffling off when we get the bowl back. Okay, it's a terrific book. You signed mine back in November. Okay, you know what, Frank, why don't you pick? And it can't be Darryl Wilson. If you win, it goes back in. Oh, terrific, Jackie. Right here. You have to twirl, model and twirl. Jackie Winter just won. So with that, Jackie won a terrific book, and we actually get to hear about that terrific book from an absolutely terrific architect. I call him a gentleman. It's because he's from Connecticut. I love people from Connecticut. And I think you're in store for a terrific program, lots of visual images. So please give a nice warm welcome for Richard, and we'll do questions and answers right after. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett, for that largely accurate introduction. Time where it's great to see you all today. Some familiar faces, mostly new faces. And I'd like to thank the PDC and John Aero Architectural Group, as well as DSI and my PR firm Domain for all their hard work today in hosting this event. Yes, the topic is Beverly Park. And what I'd like to talk about is a little bit of the history of Beverly Park, and then the work that I did in Beverly Park, some of which with my former business partner. And I've been involved on and off with Beverly Park since 1988. And I came to Los Angeles the prior year, and I worked with a firm that was instrumental in developing the design of the community, and also with the developer at the time. And I'd like to go a little bit through the history, maybe a little bit about its character, and then talk about the projects that we did there. I'm not going to show work of other firms because I'm not really intimately familiar with all of them. It's a very diverse community, but our work is representative of many of the types of houses that were built at Beverly Park. So here you can see an aerial view taken in the early 80s, and Beverly Park is right about here. This is Benedict Canyon's over here, San Ysidro Drive. That's Franklin Canyon here. Coldwater is to the right. So Beverly Park consists of 2 phases, one of which you can see is being graded is this phase here, which is called South Beverly Park. And then a larger phase called North Beverly Park is here. South is accessed from the top of San Ysidro Drive, which winds up from Benedict Canyon. And then there's a small connecting road called Summit Ridge at the top. So when you go to the top, you've probably seen there, even if you've not been to the development, there are a sign for 2 gatehouses, north and south. So South was developed first and has 17 lots. And the north side here was developed afterwards and had 64 individual lots. And the north side also is accessible from Mulholland Drive, which is approximately there. From the beginning, Beverly Park was conceived to be a prestigious neighborhood with the idea that it would eventually come to rival the prime west side neighborhoods of Bel Air, Holmby Hills, and Beverly Hills. But with the added advantage that it was going to be a gated community and therefore not accessible to the public, more private, more secure, and perhaps most importantly, away from the paparazzi. South Beverly Park was started in 1984. These properties have fairly commanding views of the LA basin. The north side opened in 1989, and the lots are quite a bit larger, approximately double the size of the lots at South Beverly Park. But most of the lots on the north side do not have commanding views of the city. There's just a few lots that have views. They're primarily lots about lots of space and property. Many of the buyers have actually accumulated contiguous lots on the north side, which are very easy to do because they're at relatively the same elevation. And one gentleman, in fact, had accumulated 4 contiguous lots around a cul-de-sac, therefore buying the cul-de-sac and turning that into his motor court. So that's the largest individual property up there, and it's 13 acres. A little bit of the history before this development. The property was originally planned to be a country club called the Beverly Hills Country Club. And it was designed by Robert Trent Jones back in 1965. And it was planned to be overlooked by several hundred houses, which would have been much smaller, maybe a few thousand square feet. However, due to the economy, work was halted, and it wasn't until 1979 that a West Side developer named Elliot Gottfried purchased the property with the idea of creating this gated community. Gottfried hired an Orange County-based land and landscape firm and planning firm called Peridian International to do the master plan. And the idea from the beginning was these would be quote-unquote estate properties, which at the time signified generally greater than 1 or 1.5 usable acres. And there were very few on the west side, believe it or not. Maybe at the time there were only about 80 properties on the entire west side that qualified. The novel idea was to create also a showroom to showcase this community. And this was on Rodeo Drive, and later became an art gallery. But at the time, the idea was you would bring people to the showroom in the center of Beverly Hills, in the heart of the shopping district, and then you would take them up to the site. And they made a very large model of the development that was about the size of a large automobile. And this is an aerial photo of that model. And right here is Summit Ridge Drive. This is the tail end of South Beverly Park, and this is North Beverly Park. And the idea was to convey what the development would eventually become. And one of the major features of this model was they made little replicas of famous estates on the west side. And this is a little close-up of what everyone knows as the Playboy Mansion, which is actually the Levitt Mansion in Holmby Hills. And at the same time, a promotional book was created and written by Jeff Hyland called The Estates of Beverly Hills. It was kind of a history of major estates in Beverly Hills, Holmby Hills, and Bel Air on the west side. But at the end was a chapter, a very short chapter on Beverly Park. And the idea, of course, that Beverly Park would eventually take its place among these communities. One of the important features of Beverly Park was the plan for large gatehouses to not only control access and provide security, but to signify the arrival to the development from the public realm to the private realm. And gatehouses were very prominent in architectural history as sort of a prelude to the country estate. And so in the case of Beverly Park, the idea for the gatehouse comes from that at Greystone, which was built between 26 and 1928 and designed by Gordon Kaufman. And this inspired both Joe Ambrose, who was the project manager at Meridian at the time, and the developer Gottfried. And here we can see the final result, which is the gatehouse to the north face, or North Beverly Park. This is a little bit larger, but it's quite similar to the smaller gatehouse on the south side. And there's also a much smaller version of this on the Mulholland Drive entrance. It's interesting to note, of course, this is a development and it has to be financially viable. And this gatehouse is largely made of plaster and cast stone with some ashlar stone accents, while Greystone is entirely made of limestone and is about that thick. So we do live in a different era when we're dealing with economics. As the project design develops, Ambrose leaves Meridian and is hired directly by Gottfried. The grand opening South Beverly Park takes place in 1984. Unfortunately, Gottfried really doesn't have the backing to develop the community, so he sells out to a development consortium led by real estate developer Brian Adler. And it's really under Adler's direction that the Beverly Park, which we know today, takes shape. Adler forms a development group, and I'll show you one more photo. This is what we see today. Adler forms a development group, and some of the properties are developed as speculative houses for sale, and properties are sold off to individual buyers, which range from people from around the world looking for houses in Los Angeles to noted celebrities. Initially, several celebrities were courted to bring notoriety to the estate, and the major one at the time was a country singer named Kenny Rogers. He planned a large residence at the community, but never built it. At the time, he ended up purchasing the Knoll and lived there for about 20 years. Beverly Park was also instrumental in creating a design or an architectural review committee, which would oversee the approval of submitted houses that were technically not done by the Adler Development Group as spec houses. And I served on that committee for a number of years and advised them within the role that we were allowed to play. Setbacks and height limits were strictly enforced, but architectural styles, as long as they were generally traditional, were considered acceptable. Although I do remember when the first contemporary house was submitted, it caused quite a furor, and the other members of the committee demanded that it be entirely screened and not visible from any point in the community. So that has since come to pass. There are maybe 3 or 4 contemporary homes in Beverly Park now, but the vast majority are very traditional. Beverly Park was very successful. As I mentioned, they developed the south face first. It sold very well. So the north phase was opened in November of 1989, and I still remember that night very clearly. It was a very difficult Santa Ana condition, and the wind was really blowing through the tent structures. It was very dry and blustery, and it seemed kind of ominous because all of you who were in LA at that time remember it was the beginning of the S&L crisis and the start of the crash of the real estate market that went probably well into early 1995. So North Beverly Park started out on a bad note and did not sell very well. Prices were much lower than they were in Beverly Hills, Bel Air, and Holmby Hills on a per square foot basis. I remember at that time you could buy a 2-acre lot for maybe $2 million max. And it wouldn't be for quite some time that the prices would really creep up and come even close to the other neighborhoods in town. And initially, most of the first lots were bought by buyers from Japan who were kind of riding the investment wave that they had during the 80s. But they all bought at the tail end and sort of the beginning of their own crisis. And all the ones I remember at that time, there were several, lost all of their properties. So those lots returned back to sale. Some were bought by individuals. I remember Rod Stewart buying, as well as investors from overseas. So Beverly Park has kind of ridden the waves of the economy since that time, enjoying buyers from Indonesia, Russia, and other countries. So, but it's done very, very well in general. I think that the prices, maybe if you were to compare directly the same property features and house qualities, would probably still be half of that if your lot was a prime Holmby Hills or Bel Air or Beverly Hills lot. But they have done very, very well. And the community has such a different feature than I remember when it started. The houses dwarfed the trees in 1989. And finally, as with time, the trees have grown up. But if we look at early pictures of Beverly Hills and Bel Air, it wasn't any different. So people were used to the older neighborhoods. And so it took a while for Beverly Park to catch on. And as Brett mentioned, people seem to either love it or hate it. It certainly attracts buyers who want quiet and privacy. And we recently remodeled a house that I'll show you in my talk, where the owners had bought it just initially as a temporary home. They thought they would just move to Bel Air or Holmby Hills. And as they spent a little bit of time there, they started to enjoy the peace and quiet and the tranquility, and yet be only 10 minutes from the center of Beverly Hills. So it had that advantage. Others have complained that they don't like driving up the merely upper middle class neighborhood of San Ysidro Drive to get to the affluent Beverly Park. So it's done very well with clients who live in Los Angeles part-time because they feel there's an added security of being in a gated community. And as far as I know to this day, it's only had one crime, and that was a theft, which turned out to be an inside job. So I'd like to show you some of my work at the park. And as I mentioned, I worked with Joe Ambrose for 6 years, and working on some of his houses, both in South and North Beverly Park. And then I left to form a partnership with Bill Hoblinski in 1995. And we practiced together for about 14 years. And we created numerous homes in the development. And as I mentioned, sat on the design review committee for some time. I'm going to go in chronological order. The houses are very eclectic in the park, and it'll show you kind of how things evolved over time. Because when we first started, the Italian villa was all in vogue in Los Angeles. In some ways, I think it might have been to shy away from the more relaxed California Mediterranean houses and be a little bit grander, as well as be a little bit lighter in tone than some of the Spanish colonial interiors, which can be kind of dark. And this is the first house that we did together, from 95 to 98. And this was kind of an exploration of Tuscan and Palladian architecture. So you can see in the front facade, we have the typical Palladian composition. Sorry, the left part is missing. So it's the typical A, B, C, B, A rhythm. And the grand central pediment. The towers are Tuscan in design with the irregular coining or stone trim at the corners. And this was designed originally as a spec house. And the idea was to create a fairly grand Italian villa, and it sold, and we later did some remodeling for the buyer. This is the rear facade, which employs some of the same ideas, but with the arcade in between the towers that becomes the outdoor living room for the loggia. When we were thinking about the house, we wanted to look not just at California houses, but houses throughout the world, including some of the original precedents for this type of house. This is the Villa Niccolini in Pisa, built through the 15th to 18th centuries. And you can see the towers, of course, back then might have been more for lookouts and security, and we've employed them as decorative motifs. And in the United States, we looked at some houses from the 20s on the grander scale. This is Vizcaya in Miami by F. Burl Hoffman and Paul Chaffin in 1916, again employing the idea of the corner towers and the lower central bay. And of course, to the most imitated architect in history, Palladio. This is the Villa Barbaro in Mazare from the 1560s. And so Palladio was the first really to add the pediment as a grand feature to the center of his villas. Prior to that, the pediment or the temple front was considered only suitable for public buildings and not for private residences. So what we wanted to do was create something different. And I do credit my former business partner with playing a big role in the reintroduction of the Italian villa in California. He had been doing that for 6 or 7 years prior to our partnership. And we saw it as a fun exploration of a totally different sense of architecture in Los Angeles. This led, like many projects, one after the other, to another villa just up the road. And this was one of the larger lots. This is about 5 total acres. And you can see this client was an avid wine enthusiast. And you drive up this very long driveway through a portal to the motor court. And then across from the front entry to the house is this 2-acre vineyard. So he was very much interested in moving to Beverly Park with the idea of creating his own wine. And then on the south side, this rear garden has a panoramic view of the city. So this allowed, the size of the property allowed us a different exploration. The other property was more typical of the smaller 2-acre lots. This is more typical of the larger properties that have hillside with them. And so you can get to have this really fun exploration. These are the entry gates, and these are a pair of antique gates from an estate in upstate New York that the owner found in a showroom. And so we designed these very grand piers and then flanked the driveway by palm trees. So you really can't get a sense of the house until you actually go up and arrive. And this is driving through the portal, looking at the tower in the distance and the fountain. And that's the same in the evening. Many of these houses, of course, are much more romantic at night. And this is a view from the top of the vineyard back to the estate. We wanted the front to be very low-key. It has a kind of a Tuscan-inspired entry surround and pedimented door surrounds on the side. So we didn't want it to be too grand. We wanted to save that for the private realm at the back of the house, where, again, we explored a Palladian theme mixed with the loggia's Tuscan architecture. Again, looking at precedents, which we do a lot in our work. This is the Villa Corsi in Florence from the 16th to 18th centuries, showing you the very simple openings with the pediments that are triangular and segmental or curved. And again, the Villa Barbaro, one of our favorites. On the interior, we wanted it to be very simple. The owner had a lot of artwork and furniture and antiques, and we wanted the architecture to imitate that of the simpler Palladian villas, which are very plain and rely mostly on their geometry without a lot of ornament. And I'll just go through some of the photos of the house with you. These are the galleries on either side. One of the things we were doing when we were designing is many clients would say, we love older houses, but they're often very dark and not lively enough. They're a little bit moody to us. And we like a lot of the details and features, but we like brighter houses. And we all have to respond to our clients' needs as well as some of the trends of the day. So we developed this idea that all the major rooms would just face south, and on the north side there would be these long galleries that would be vaulted. And the galleries would be wide enough so that when you have parties, people can flow from space to space, use the galleries, go out to the terrace, back into the room. But the houses would always be very bright and lively. This is the living room, which is off of that gallery that you just saw. And we found an antique fireplace for the owner in this. This is the library. It's all done in mahogany with an antique fireplace as well. And this is one of the owner's favorite rooms, as you can imagine. This is a wine cellar we did in the basement that also doubles as a movie theater. So the screen comes down from a slot here, and the projector comes down here mechanically. I'm sure DSI does this stuff all the time. This next residence posed a great challenge. So this is still in the mid to late 90s, and a client from overseas came to us, and she really wanted an enormous house. And it ended up being about a little over 30,000 square feet. And there weren't that many houses really being built at that time that were that large, just a handful. Most of the houses were in the 12 to 15, 17,000 square feet size max. What we did was develop a modified 9-square plan, or a courtyard plan. And this goes back, of course, to Roman antiquity, and where you'd always return to the courtyard in the center. Of course, that would be open air with a fountain. Our idea was you would roof that over, it would become a great hall in the center. And there were a few really wonderful old houses on the East Coast done in the late 1890s to about 1920, such as the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, and Chetwood by Horace Trumbauer. So we looked at that kind of a design. So this is the site plan coming in the motor court, the access to the view. That allowed the tennis court to be placed against the hillside here. And the 9-square house is here, and the courtyard roofed over is here. And the houses that we looked at were such as like Wiley Hall by Lewis Wyatt, and this is from the early 19th century in England. This is a rendering we did of the living room, and this was a 52-foot long space with double fireplaces, and then there were rooms off of each end. This is the garden room where she brought a muralist in to paint these paintings, and so eventually this would become kind of the tea room or tea salon. So you can kind of get the feel for the eclectic nature of the projects. This was the first house at the park with an underground parking garage. That started to come in vogue about this time when I mean, it's kind of interesting, the idea that Beverly Park lots were larger, but clients would want more and more space, and they would find that the parking would take up so much space, it became valuable to go underground in many cases. So this was the first explored at the development. Now, Beverly Park is not entirely filled with enormous houses. We were approached in '96 by a client who really wanted a small house by comparison. The house without the garages, probably barely 8,000 square feet. They were very concerned that the house would look too small. and people might think it was someone's guest house, or it wasn't really part of the park. So we were faced with a little bit of a challenge of how do we make it look artificially larger. So here's a site plan. It's one of the smaller houses in the park. Now tastefully larger though. So it's only about 1.5 acres. It does have a nice view. There's a really huge and hideous house here. I won't mention any names, but there's no house right here. So it has some privacy. So what we developed was the idea that there would be a long facade across. You would drive through archways to get the parking and the garage in the back. And then there'd be a garden opening on the other side that would match it. So the house would appear artificially larger. And then this wing would block the view of this when you're in this area. So here's a rendering of the facade. And what we looked at, this is also one of the few lots that had a very severe height limit. Most of the lots in Beverly Park had you could go up to 45 feet. This one you could only go up to 32 because there were some view corridors from upper lots that wanted to be maintained. So in this project, our idea was to look more at the smaller Italian villas and then houses that imitated them in the United States. And so you can see the matching archways, one for vehicular and pedestrian access, and then a very simple facade where the ornament is concentrated at the entry. And so this is a shot of the house, and you can see the garage archway on the right. And so, in thinking about it, our inspiration in Italy was the Villa Gambaria, which is outside of Florence, and this is done between the 17th and 18th centuries. But it's typical of the smaller Italian villas where you might have a much more modest country house. And we saw these wing walls that were extended from the house that gave it an artificial appearance of being larger. And the same was true of a house that Wallace Neff designed in Pasadena called the Collins Residence in 1928. Ironically, about 3 years later, we would remodel this house for the buyer. So it's kind of fun that it was one of the houses that inspired us, and then we would work on its remodel. This is a close-up of the entry facade, and it was the one place we wanted to have a bit of a flourish, and so we used the risalto motif that was developed primarily in Italian churches to unite a window or opening above a main entry. And we thought it would be a fun motif for the house, but very restrained and kind of flat, so that the house would still feel more 20s in feeling. And of course utilize the exposed rafters, which are typical of the Tuscan era. This is a shot of the rear, so you can see how nicely the other house neighbor is hidden. And primarily, it's a series of loggias and arcades on the back to enjoy sitting out in the sun and enjoying one of the few view lots in the park. This is just a shot of the stair hall, and we wanted to create kind of a little complicated entry space. As you can see, it's pretty diminutive. If I told you it was in Beverly Park initially, you might not believe me. And it's just a small 2-story space with a series of vaults and arches that creates kind of an interesting entry, and you come in under the landing, and then the stair wraps around you and goes up. These are the gallery spaces again between the rooms and the loggia on a more intimate scale. This is the outdoor loggia. Now, one of the things that happens as you're an architect, people like to ask you to sometimes remodel after you've designed. In this case, the owner was absent from the country maybe 3/4 of the year, and they found that birds rather enjoyed living in their home. So we added all these French doors to the loggia so that they could open them when they were in residence, but close them when they were traveling. This is a photograph of the living room. Back to the grander scale. This next house was our study in a northern Italian villa. We wanted to explore a lot of different Italian styles. And we looked a little bit at Palladio, but also some of the grander villas in the north. And this property is one of the typical sort of interior lots in the park where it's fairly big and it's all flat. There's no slope to speak of, but it has no view. So the house is all about the garden. This began as a spec house in 1997. And it's approximately 30,000 square feet, and it has a full basement. So you actually can arrive in the motor court, come into the entry, or drive down this way. It had about a 16-car parking garage, movie theater, gym, all the amenities. It was really one of the last of the grand spec houses to be built at the park, sort of just before the dot-com bust. And it was bought by a gentleman that had created a software company and cashed out. And we spent many years remodeling it for him. And then he divorced and suddenly discovered he was the only one living in this 30-some thousand square foot house. It was a little bit large. So he sold the house, and an interesting story. The buyer visited a friend across the street and just said, "Oh, it'd be fun to live here." And he said, "I like that house across the street." And his friend said, "Well, just make him an offer." So one day our client got a completely unsolicited offer for a number he could not refuse. So these things happen. This is a rendering we did of the front facade. And you can see now we're on one of the lots without a height restriction. And it was kind of fun. When working on this, we wanted to make the house taller than is allowed in the city of LA, which had a limit of 45 feet. Beverly Park technically has no limit if the Architectural Review Committee will give a waiver. So I had to abstain, of course. And we got this at 50 feet, which is the legal limit for any Type 5 construction. The city deferred, saying it's a gated community, we don't care what you do. It's all up to the community. So this is the tallest single residence in Beverly Park, and probably one of the tallest in LA. And so you can see we did a very grand central block, a recessed middle wings, and then these projecting side wings, and we did do the sundials, which are kind of fun. You have to have just the right orientation to pull off a sundial. And this is the entry facade. Just a little view. This is the third buyer and client of ours for the house. Would only let us take a few shots again. Seems to be typical of some of the foreign clients. This is a shot of the back and the start of the gardens. And these are the kind of houses we looked at for this project. And this is the Villa Negri Latte by Giorgio Mazzari in Treviso. And this is from the 18th century. So grander, taller houses, features of how to unite the pediment, as you can see, with the side wings, which are lower. I thought it'd also be fun just to show you, even intersperse a few projects that were not built from time to time. You often spend months or years doing these and end up with a few nice renderings as a result. So this is someone, it also shows you some of the other styles that have developed in the park over time. This client said, I want a Loire chateau. He was basically a playboy whose parents had a lot of money and just thought this would be an amusing kind of house to have in the United States as a diversion from time to time. And he was an avid wine collector as well. It was never built, as I mentioned, but we had an enormously fun time designing the two-story discotheque. So it's the only house where we've been asked to design a discotheque at that time. Since then, we've done one, so we can't say that anymore. But this was two-story, and just had a lot of fun, bizarre things. Two-way mirrors around, so you could watch guests, or guests wouldn't know it. But every now and then, you get a really an amusing client, and it's a shame. It never went through. But our goal was to really think about, how would we make a modern day version of this style. It's obviously not a common style, particularly in Southern California. Another in a series of grand Italian villas was this spec house we designed in 1999, and it was really the last spec house. And it was developed by the neighbor who was a client of ours to the left of this. And he wanted to create a sort of an over-the-top spec again, and this was in excess of 30,000 square feet. And this is the rendering that we did for him. And I'm sure many of you in the design world know many times you have a house that you can't photograph. And that's because things weren't always done exactly the way you wanted or furnished exactly the way you wanted. Photos only look good if everything is done to the right degree. So this is an aerial view, which you can all get on the internet, which shows you kind of the scope and magnitude, and just kind of gives you a feel for generally the character of Beverly Park. So you have typically the streets in Beverly Park have grass parkways in which they planted trees, and they've done in the same manner as in Beverly Hills. They planted each individual street with the same type of tree. And then the community governs this area here, and then the rest of that is left up to the individual owner. So the house we had designed was here, which I showed you earlier, was the second residence with the vineyard. And this was one of the very large properties, so it could take quite an expansive house and still have a big garden. But you can kind of get a feel for the density of the community. This is, I think, a guest house or pool house for the adjacent property, which is approximately the same size. So this kind of gives you, a flavor for it. This is one of the properties on the east side that overlooks Franklin Canyon. So there are no neighbors on this side, which is quite nice. And DWP has an easement, a power easement here that they don't seem to use. So people just took over that property, even though they can't build anything on it. And we're able to extend out their gardens quite substantially. One of our favorite projects, which was quite a bit of fun, was our creation of a Paris Regent house from the 17th century. And there are many French houses at Beverly Park. And this client specifically liked a little bit of an earlier period where the roofs and pitches are very tall. So this is a site plan. This is about a 5-acre lot when you add in all the hillside area. So we have a driveway. And the owner had quite a lot of program. One of the challenges in creating a big estate is to always get the garage out of the way. First of all, the garages tend to be less attractive than the rest of the house, and their openings are so big they kind of rival the front doors of houses. So in the estates, we try to get these in their own courts. So we created this half ellipse in the motor court, and then tucked the garages behind here. And then completed the ellipse with a wall and piers here. So I have a very formal sense of arrival. And then it has the main view to the city is this way. So we organized the house in that way. And then we created a cross axis with the swimming pool, pavilion, and tennis court. In the course of our work, we do a lot of renderings, and this is the kind of rendering we might do to show the client the general feel of this house. So of course, this is with the wall, the elliptical wall removed. This is the rear. You can see from the site plan, they moved the swimming pool. We've had swimming pools move up to 7 times. once 3 times during construction. So this house was fun in that the owner worked at home a lot, so the entire top floor is his office and studio. And again, this was a lot with a 45-foot height limit, so we were able to explore that. These are some of the precedences that we looked at. This is the Chateau at Maisons by Francois Mansart. You may or may not know of Mansart, but you know of his roof, or at least the roof that he made famous. This was typical French roof of the time, and certainly he did not invent it, but he did popularize it. And this is the Chateau Menards. This was later, in the version we see here, remodeled by a famous French architect of the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Gabriel. You may know him as having done a lot of work at Versailles, the Petit Trianon, and other major buildings. This kind of gives you a feel for the arrival. These are the entry gates. There's only one house in all of Beverly Park that does not have street walls and gates. And it's actually in the south phase. The owner didn't see the need to, considering he was already in a gated community. That's not been the norm, of course. It's unlikely that anyone's going to wander into your house, although maybe one of your neighbors who might be a little nosy might come in during construction. But every other one has had an entry, and so even though you couldn't see anything beyond, this client wanted a very private entry, so we did a solid gate. This is kind of entering at the top of the driveway through the elliptical wall and piers where there's a second gateway. That is always open unless the owner is out of town. So this is a twilight shot of the house. One of the problems in photographing houses, just as a side point, is most entrances tend to face north because you don't need direct light coming in on that side. They are very difficult to shoot. So this is what happens when you shoot the north side during the day. But it's the only time you can really kind of get a feel for it. So this is the main entry to the house, the 2-story entry feature with the segmental pediment, which was very popular in 17th century France, and the tall roofs, the big dormers, and as you'll see in some other photos, where you just make it out of, right? Chimneys as tall as LA would allow us to do. And this is the south side with a final resting place for the swimming pool in the center. The entire south side is a loggia, or arc, which we designed in sort of the French arcade style. So it would feel part of the architecture and not alien to the style of the house, but since it becomes the outdoor living room, as we would have in Southern California, it's probably one of the most used spaces in the house. And so the house is vaguely an H shape in plan. And then this, of course, is the owner's studio and his private balcony, which has the best view. This is the cross-axis from the swimming pool to the pavilion that mediates between the pool and the tennis court. And so here you can sit and enjoy the shade and either watch tennis or people swimming. This is the entry hall to the house. So this was done in kind of in a modern French style. You'll see some antiques, some new pieces. It was not meant to be a period interior at all, but have a certain amount of period flavor. This is the 2-story central hall right after that space. And this is all done in stuc pierre. work, which is a plaster made in imitation of limestone. The funny thing is, it's almost as expensive as the real thing now, when it had been developed in France to be more economical. This is the living room. The dining room, which was done in a very pale green paneling. The walnut library. And then when you got to the family rooms, they became a little bit more French country, loosely French country in feel, with these more rustic fireplaces and beam ceilings. One of the problems in designing houses is there's one object which takes precedence over every other single interior object in every house, in almost every room, and that is the television. Of course, this does predate the smartphone, but so the interior designer had an idea that he would hide the TV behind this screen, which would fold over and then reveal itself. It unfortunately wasn't mechanical, so who knows how much use it's gotten. This is the breakfast room, which had a dome ceiling and a lantern with the chandelier hanging through the the dome. This is the kitchen, kind of our modern interpretation of a French country kitchen. And the room that everyone goes to, this is shows you about half of the entire back loggia. And we did it in 3 different spaces, so we could have different feels. One as a fireplace, one a water feature, and then a lot of furnishings in the center where you could either lounge or have dinner. This is the corner one with the fireplace. In keeping with just the final house that wasn't built, we were asked to remodel a very mediocre residence that was pretty large, had no sense of garden or design, again, no names, and create somewhat of a major garden statement, which we did with Stephen Sussman from San Francisco. And it's kind of, this is sort of, the house had a look of sort of a luxury tract French house. And it was done actually for the client, but the client was an overseas investor who said he really wasn't involved, he just kind of let someone in LA run the project, but he realized it wasn't exactly up to his expectations. So we did this master plan and did this rendering of turning it in from a tract house into a grand French house, more 18th century in feel, with a lot of applied ornament, changing the roofs, making it perfectly symmetrical, which it was not. And then doing this garden facade, again, trying to create a very grand statement and unifying, which is a rather badly designed house. And he was very excited about it until he got the budget. So, fortunately, that's the way some of those things go. And the last house that I'll show you was a real fun one. And not least because the clients were really wonderful people and the interior designer was great. The clients had approached us that they were going to live in Bel Air, but they needed a temporary house because the husband was coming from the East Coast for work. And so they bought this as a temporary house. And the husband was, like many of our husband clients, are vaguely interested as long as they know time, money, and some of the features. So this was really her project. And she was quite worried because the house was really horrendous. And that's the only way to put it. It was built in the mid-90s as a spec house, and you may have remembered sort of the tail end of Columbia Savings and Loan having done a number of spec houses, and they all looked vaguely French-English country, but with very modernish interiors and plans. It was quite popular, I think, in the 80s and 90s to take modern floor plans and apply traditional moldings and details and call it a traditional house, when in fact it bears no resemblance to a traditional house. So they thought of this as going to be very much a temporary house. So what could we do to it? And this is the site plan. This is actually one of the larger properties on the south side. Oh, sorry, giving you a preview. It's a very long house and a little bit more casual in its outside appearance. What we did to make it a grander estate was to move the retaining wall from here to there. And 7 figures later, we accomplished that. But we more than doubled the size of the entire rear yard, and it made a big, big difference. So for the price of this lot, which probably was half of that of a lot in Bel Air, they were able to get about double the property and have a very tranquil, private view. They overlook a canyon and a hillside next door. So the house was kind of loosely a French country house, and our approach was to make it more French country. It had a very modern entrance and no real substantial architectural features. So we left the fieldstone and then added it in numerous places where it was absent. Redesigned, it had a very modern entry door with 3 square windows above, and it looked really ridiculous. And it was kind of amusing. After this went up, the neighbor next door came, "Why did you take down that beautiful entry?" So we added this segmental pediment surround. We added the dormers, altered all the chimney caps to have detail, made the shutters real instead of applied, added the stone into the gates, new French gates instead of the modern gate that they had, and redid most of the landscaping with the exception of a few mature trees that we left on the side. This is a close-up of the entry surround, done in French limestone, and the interior designer found this wonderful antique door by accident going through a studio, so we incorporated it into the design, and it has a central doorknob in the center, which is kind of fun. The interior is more about a modern French interior. So the idea for the house was someone was going from the city to the country, and they found this country house and restored it, but they wanted to update the interior. And they're a very young family, and they didn't want it to feel dowdy, they wanted it to feel fresh, and they wanted it to showcase their modern art collection. So this is a shot of the entry hall, and one of the funny things we had to deal with was this space was 2-story, with a bridge running through the middle of it. And it looked like a flying bridge you might see in a shopping mall or something like that. And so we filled it in and brought down the scale of the space, basically changed every single molding and detail in the house, which was, think sort of early 90s when people did those bullnose counters like that, that looked strong enough to stop a moving Suburban. So we removed all of that kind of detailing and changed virtually every material in the house. This was done in a faux painted limestone as a decorative treatment. This is the reception room off of that foyer viewing to the living room beyond. And the interior designer found these really interesting antique columns in San Francisco, which are sort of the typical of the rusticated columns you'll see in France in the 18th century in the work of Ledoux. And again, it's shot through to the living room. So we used a traditional framework. All the moldings were derived from those of the Petit Trianon at Versailles, but then lightened it up, made it more modern in feel. This is the dining room. Again, our theme in the main rooms was all the main rooms, formal rooms, would have painted paneling. This is the movie theater, which we thought might get a little bit more deco. And it has, so far it's our only movie theater that actually has a stage. It's about 11 feet deep. This is the men's powder room. And this is the ladies' powder room. And then when we got into the family room side of the house, again, it became a little bit more like a streamlined French country look, obviously with, again, the even more streamlined furnishings. And then the house had no loggia. It had the perfect view and perfect backyard for it. So we created this loggia off the house, which is really the outdoor living room for dining, seating. And yes, there is a television hidden on the left side. And that's kind of gives you a little bit of the feel for many of the homes at Beverly Park where you'll have these nice hillside views, which are really pretty. This is the kitchen. And then in that really hideous two-story space, we created this alcove off the second floor where if you were coming out of all the bedrooms, you could meet here. And the owner loves reading to her children in this space. We have bookshelves on both sides. This is the master bedroom. Close-up of the fireplace. And this is her bath, which is all done in a white onyx. Not all of our houses have hair salons, but we have a few, and I thought I'd show you one. This is one of those things, many clients go, they always have these Midas wells, and as they're going through, they add up to millions of dollars, and so one of the Midas wells was having a hair salon, so we were trying to figure out a spot for it. And we realized, well, we don't need that many staff rooms, so why don't we just take one of them and turn them into a hair salon? And to end the tour, this is the swimming pool and pool cabana at night, which gives you kind of a feel of the area. The trees have really grown in. You have to think of these trees have gone in at maybe 15 to 20 feet at some point. Many of the pine trees are 40 feet, 50 feet tall. Now they're going through the exercise of actually pruning the neighborhood. Something was hard to envision, certainly when I started working there in October of '88. So it's been kind of it's been a really fun environment in which to work. The idea that you could live like this up in the hills and be 10 or 15 minutes from your office, even in a mid-rise building or a high-rise. So it's had a lot of appeal for many clients, and I think this image kind of captures that in a sense, the tranquility, the peace, what you can do architecturally, and so I would have to say Beverly Park has been good to me, and I hope Beverly Park's been good for Los Angeles. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.